So today we are joined by Sarah Baxendale and Gregory Landois from Regen Network. And if you aren't familiar, Regen Network are among the early founders and leaders of the ReFi movement, which is the effort to combine Web3 technologies with social goods, sustainability, and climate technology. And I am super glad to have Greg and Sarah on here to talk about new developments from Regen Network in 2023 and perhaps some perspective, maybe looking back at 2022 and maybe some forward-looking, potentially good news for 2023. So having said that, based on what you're seeing currently in the market, in the climate space, what can we look forward to from Regen Network in 2023? For either.
Rex, awesome to be here. Well, I'll just say hi, and yeah, super grateful to be here and to get to jam a little bit. And maybe I'll pass the baton on to Sarah, because in the lead up, what listeners won't know is that she just gave a brilliant synopsis answer to that. So maybe she can introduce herself briefly and then give a quick answer to that question.
Yeah, I'm Sarah from Regen Network. I'm our director of ecosystems. So my job is to weave in places in the shadows and pull things together. But there's a lot moving in the world of Regen coming up in 2023, which is super exciting. This fall, in fall of 2022, we launched Regen Marketplace, which is our application for buying carbon credits and other ecological assets that are tokenized on the blockchain. And that launch featured the first real registry to blockchain partnership of City Forest Credits Registry, putting nearly all of the credits they've ever produced onto the blockchain in the Regen Network marketplace. So for the very first time, a full registry from the traditional carbon world put their entire portfolio of credits for sale onto a blockchain marketplace and tokenized them. So folks can go there, they can use the app, they can make purchases of credits, they can retire credits, trade them, sell them. And then we're also gearing up this spring for the launch of Nature Carbon 10, which is a real world carbon asset pool of Vera credits that were tokenized originally by the Toucan protocol, which we developed a standard for with Toucan and Moss over a year ago. And we are launching a bridge between Regen Ledger, the code of Regen Network, and Polygon in order to be able to move Nature Carbon 10 between the Polygon ecosystem and the Cosmos ecosystem, which are two of the largest ReFi ecosystems on the blockchain. And we'll be launching pools of Nature Carbon 10 on the Osmosis exchange, which brings for the very first time carbon, which is a real world asset. It's a financial commodity, a digitized form of it into the Cosmos ecosystem. And along with that launch, we are working through a really big community-wide campaign called Cosmos Zero, where validators and a really significant number of protocols in the Cosmos ecosystem are using the power of community governance to put up proposals to their community pools to become carbon neutral by buying NCT in the Osmosis exchange and City Forest Credits and Regen Network. And so far, I have a fun little board, which I look at many times a day, hoping that more protocols will join the campaign. But so far, we have commitments from Checked, Empower, IXO, Osmosis, and Regen. At this very moment, Agoric and Akash are in a vote to become carbon neutral. Gravity Bridge, Injective, and Juno are in discussion, and launching next week are Cosmos Hub and Evmos, which are two of the biggest chains. So there's a wave of climate impact responsibility happening in the Cosmos ecosystem, and we're just really excited to be a part of the process and to have so many validators and protocols utilizing the power of community and community decision-making to take responsibility for their carbon footprint all at one time. So maybe I'll pause there because that's kind of two really big things. There's a lot of other great stuff happening in our ecosystem, but I think maybe I'll see what else Gregory's got to add here first.
Well, I think that's such a great overview. And I think the synopsis here is that interchain carbon is now a thing. We are about to have carbon liquidity. We have digitally native assets that are coming into a community-owned marketplace. that's disintermediated. There's just the list of milestones that what Sarah just gave us the summary of is so monumental. It's been really, it's been really 5 years of work to get to the stage where now things are happening in the marketplace, driven by governance, community engagement. So it's 2023, we're sort of starting off with this enormous amount of really heavy lifting that took place, not just in 2022, but for the previous years, really. One thing I will add on top of all of that, and then we can sort of circle back and continue to hype how cool it is to have on-chain carbon. One thing I'll add that I'm very excited about is that there's a set of regen native credits, eco credits that are coming on chain in the first quarter of this year. And among those are actually biodiversity credits and holistic ecological health credits that aren't just carbon. And that's something I'm particularly passionate about and excited to start to see moving forward. It's really interesting. Carbon is important, and it's important to get a price on carbon. And maybe we can talk about the how and the why of that, because it's an important element of the regenerative finance vision and of what Regen Network is doing in the world, of course. But also beyond carbon, there's an entire world of real world ecological assets that we depend on. The human economy depends on, the health of the planet depends on, and biodiversity is really, a super exciting thing that's coming on the horizon, and that the first steps have started to be taken towards that. And it's been on my mind because I spent, right before the holidays, I spent one of my last working weeks before I took a little bit of a break up in Montreal at the Biodiversity Congress of the Parties, which is this global gathering of leaders, nation states, corporate leaders, working through agreements. In this case, COP15 is about biodiversity, about agreements and treaties around protecting global biodiversity. And there was really a monumental and watershed set of agreements that were created, that part of that has created this huge market space for a new set of ecological assets focused on biodiversity stewardship and commitment from all of the signatory countries to enforce reporting requirements and goals and the achievement of goals regarding protecting biodiversity from corporations who are operating in those companies. So it was really big, actually. It's a really big deal. And so in addition to kind of the carbon economy that's starting to evolve, where we're starting to understand that to have a stable climate, we need to price carbon, and we need to incentivize, by doing that, incentivize people to sequester carbon and store carbon in living systems or reduce emissions in different ways. Also, it's important to understand that that's just one piece of a more holistic puzzle, and biodiversity is another very important piece of that. And when you get this intersection of biodiversity and carbon, we really start to see what a regenerative asset might look like, where it isn't just carbon tunnel vision and carbon reductionism, but instead we're starting to see that when you, at the intersection of biodiversity and carbon, regeneration is taking place. And that's really, at the end of the day, Regen Network, our aim as a disintermediated and peer-to-peer marketplace connected to a registry system for these real world ecological assets to be created, to be monitored, reported, verified, and minted, and then to be able to be traded and retired. All of that is for a purpose. And that purpose is actually to accelerate ecological regeneration and conservation. And that's why we're all doing it day after day. And again, such big milestones have been achieved in 2022, but looking forward, there's this really, I think, quantum leap that's about to take place at Regen and beyond.
Yeah, I would say that when I joined Web3, there's this quote about the economy and the stock market. And like I can't remember who said it, but he's like the economy is like this guy walking a dog in the park, and the dog is like the stock market, and like the dog can run way ahead and like, you know, do all kinds of stuff. But ultimately the stock market is attached to the economy, and like the dog can run all over the place, but it can never escape this like leash it's on. And it felt like the whole Web3 space, like it was like that dog that ran as like far as humanly possible, and then it just got yanked back over the last year. And a lot of people are sitting like the core deliverable of Web3, like the promise when you look at it is, in theory, it allows you know, obviously instant, scalable, free transactions and money that is as free as email and speech in many ways. And in theory, the value proposition of Web3 to something like the carbon market or these other markets is that it allows federation and defragmentation of those markets. And it allows freeing up what's called an illiquid asset, like so carbon from over there and carbon from over there that are all on different standards. They can't be traded readily, whereas like with Web3, you're able to do that. So it seems like right now, starting 2023, that the dog has been yanked back after, you know, having a good time. And now it's come back to this real world assets topic, which is like, okay, maybe these things need to be backed by something. Like at the end of the day, like trading Bored Apes and things and like paying $200,000 for something just because you like the art or something. I think that argument isn't around as much right now. Whereas it's like, I want a tokenized security or tokenized piece of something. So what do you think is going to be the main theme of 2023? Like it seems like a lot of the infrastructure went into place last year, and you said like something big is coming. Like, what do you think is what's the state of the market going to be at the end of 2023?
Well, look, I think we have to just accept that crypto markets are correlated to the larger macroeconomic reality. And so there isn't an answer that's disconnected from the larger macroeconomic reality. And as far as I can tell, it's going to be a tough year. And I don't hear anybody saying, oh, yeah, by July, everything's going to be fine. I think most people are thinking that this is going to be a year, 18 months, or 2 years in a recession cycle that's really just getting started right now. And so I think that's probably sideways trading, or maybe even a little bit further to go down in terms of where the crypto market is specifically, in the stock markets. And again, it's sort of all correlated. What is an interesting island of lack of correlation, I think, is actually climate related investment and activity. So I think what we're seeing is that we're just getting started. We're just getting started in a climate and natural capital boom cycle, right? And so that's not gonna, so it's not gonna sort of like accelerate into a hockey stick while the rest of the macroeconomic conditions are what they are. But I do think that there's sort of an island of opportunity for those of us who are really solving these real world problems with real world assets to be building and engaged, and sort of like there's still appetite for carbon offsetting. There's still sort of like the gears are still churning. It's just not a crazy hyped world, but it's still moving along. So I think there's still a little bit of lift, moving forward through 2023 in this specific sort of sector. But I think we also need to just understand that it's, macroeconomic conditions we had a big overshoot. We had COVID, we printed a bunch of money. We've got a war in Europe. There's all sorts of different levels of uncertainty and challenges. and people are pretty spooked and sort of, retracting, and there's essentially what looks to be a recession. And I'm not an economist, so that's not meant to be financial advice. That's just my sense of things. I'm not expecting some sort of like big rosy crypto comeback in the spring or something like that. My guess is this is it's going to be a long haul, and then things will start to move, and the crypto markets will continue to move. I don't think anything really changes as far as the commitment to this type of digital infrastructure that we're talking about. Web3 digital infrastructure is deep and across the board, and there are institutions, and there's sort of like the birth of the crypto native and Web3 native institutions. I don't think that's going to change. This isn't going to just wash out the whole crypto markets, but it's also, I don't think, something that we just see a short-term recovery and everybody's back to, swapping Bored Apes for millions of dollars.
It seems like, in particular, at least looking at the gaming market, like I went to Gamescom in Germany, and I went there assuming that there's going to be a lot of Web3 topics, but the reality was it's like a 600,000 person event, and maybe 1 in 50 of the booth projects were Web3 related. It was very, very low penetration. And when I walked around, I walked out of there and I was like, okay, these game developers, I'll equate this to refi in a second. They don't really want to care about how stuff is working on the back end. They just want to make a game and they want payments to be integrated. So my conclusion was that what's going to happen is that the payments providers that they're using, the tipping point will be when those game developers are able to just switch back and forth to crypto through those payment gateways. And then that will tip over the whole market. So it was like, well, if I'm going to focus my energy, it'll be on like the highest leverage point in the market. And in the refi space, I think maybe it's those carbon registries. And like, it seems last year that Vera and Gold Standard, like maybe they were initially shocked by the tokenization of what they're doing, but now it seems like how would you characterize it? Are they going with it? Or are they gonna grab onto it? Is that the future for them, or are they still hesitant? Like, what's your experience been?
So I don't think it's likely that Vera, for instance, is going to jump onto the tokenized carbon bandwagon before the end of the year. I think they're going to be thorough and slow to adopt this technology, and they're going to ensure that it meets their specific standard, institutional and community standards and needs. And I think there are some ways that is going to run counter to the expectations of like endless liquidity and market efficiency that some of the people in the Web3 space have. I would guess that Gold Standard may move a little quicker around pilots to tokenize carbon and play around with things, and probably other registries as well. I mean, like City Forest Registry worked with us to tokenize their credits. The biocarbon registry is working with Thalo to tokenize their biochar credits. So you already see sort of smaller, more agile registries making experiments. And I think the bigger ones will be looking at that and deciding how they're going to engage, and also participating in these working groups and engaging in that way. I know we've had some very productive conversations with Vera and Gold Standard, and I think their reasons for moving slow are understandable, if sometimes frustrating. Right? So yeah, I don't know, I don't think that there's going to be a big sort of like sea change or shift, and that all of a sudden there's going to be an embrace, especially, just to be honest, even after FTX happened. Even though that has really very little to do with Web3, that was just like a classical, it seems to be that was just a classical example of fraud. And it happens to have been leveraging and utilizing this, like, amazing, attractive new asset class, the digital assets, but really it was just somebody kind of, it seems like, right? Who knows, but it seems like it was just somebody committing fraud. But even though those of us who are kind of in the industry and know what's happening and how that ended up happening and how disconnected that is from sort of like the infrastructure and the economic potential and the community engagement and governance potential that Web3 has, I think a lot of people just sort of say like crypto, Web3, FTX, Terra, fraud, that's all that is, and aren't going to look a lot deeper than that. So we are going to have to kind of, work through that and have the examples of high integrity use cases and real sort of engagement to break through that new resistance that's been created.
Might need several rebrands.
Maybe. I think that there is a little bit of a shift that has happened though in the light of this that is actually really positive, because I feel like this conversation went very like, oh no, is anyone going to take Web3 seriously? But one of the things that happened really in a succinct fashion and felt very real this fall is that I think a lot of the different climate refi projects have been woven together throughout the past year. Since the launch of KlimaDAO, lots of people came to Refi Summit. There's groups of people that came to the greenhouse retreat in Colombia. And where I do think that we are much, much stronger as an industry of blockchain technology for climate solutions is that we know each other. We're working together in working groups across the industry. That work is very tactile and real and legitimate. It's about standards and data structure. And the more of this type of, connected, deep thinking work we do across industry, cross protocol, cross project, cross DApp, the more all of our work in the digital tokenized carbon and ecological asset space becomes connected. So I think that in 2023, we're going to see really intelligent work done by our collective in these working groups, as well as I think that we're going to start to see more bridging mechanisms to be able to move carbon and ecological assets from where it's sort of stuck in one ecosystem and can't get to another ecosystem. So I see a lot of the boundaries of the climate crypto tribalism coming down in the name of really having shared relationships, shared technology, shared development plans, and that if we swing back up and the markets go up in 2025, I think that shared infrastructure might be our most valuable collective asset. And I'm excited to see when the market ticks back up and all of our technology has the capacity to technically speak to each other, how effective that carbon accounting on the blockchain can be when all the different pieces of it written in all the different codes are able to talk to each other and create one connected system of technology that is ultimately has to be and will be, because of how strong blockchain technology is, it's going to be a lot more effective and transparent connected system than any of the information from registries that are off chain. So if we do our job, I think we become this powerhouse of technological development, and it really is going to be dependent upon our capacity to work together and invest in shared environments across the broader ecosystem throughout this year.
One of the terms I'm hearing more and more, and this is not a new term, and Web3 wasn't a new term either, was Fediverse. And part of this is coming because Twitter is, God knows what is happening with Twitter, but Mastodon is a Fediverse kind of project. It's like I'm seeing this term being used more and more as like almost like a replacement for decentralized. So this kind of like federated set of projects that talk to each other via protocols. Is this something you're hearing more of, or is that ring any bells for you with this kind of idea?
I don't know that I've heard that term, or I mean, maybe you have, Gregory, but I do think that there are alliances and working groups standing up that are looking at interoperability and are looking at cross-chain carbon and are looking at how to develop standards for metadata for real world ecological information on the blockchain, and how robust does that data have to be. And where's the data sourced and how does it travel with the asset? And these are really technical questions. They're really scientific, like environmental science questions, as well as engineering questions, and they take a lot of time to answer. So I think that there are federations forming. Maybe I just haven't heard that word being used. Have you heard that word, Gregory?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think yes. I think it's a more specific word than just decentralized. You know, we live in a federal government after all, with, you know, those of us who are in the United States. The European Union has a federal system. There's a lot of precedent for how you bring together entities while maintaining certain levels of sovereignty or autonomy, but also create standards. Like in the European Union, they have the same money, and they have national governance, but also there are certain agreements that they have in common, right? Economic agreements, trade agreements, passage of people back and forth. And I think, you know, I think the vision, the Cosmos vision for sort of sovereign but interoperable state machines allows people to federate, to confederate, or to remain completely neutral. And I think depending on economic situations and political situations, you are going to see a lot more federation taking place. And I think carbon markets, for instance, you know, like in Regen, just talk about Regen network architecture. So, and there's nested layers of this, and there's different scales that this kind of pattern can take place. But so just thinking of the first scale, we've been experimenting with our own registry service and system. And what a registry system is in carbon markets is a quality assurance system, whereby in order to create a real world asset, the purchaser of that real world asset understands that there's been a process that has been gone through. In our case, there's an internal review, there's an external audit, there's a peer review process, there's all these checks, and then bing, token gets minted, right? And we're sort of like working on automating that and building the appropriate technological augmentation and processes. But at the end of the day, there's a community, there are people, and they're checking all the boxes, dotting the I's, crossing the T's, and making sure that that carbon credit represents the carbon that it claims. But that's only one registry. There's also, as we mentioned earlier, there's Verra, there's Gold Standard. At the end of the day, we as a ecosystem, as a community, as an industry, we need to have standards. Now, on Regen Ledger, it would be completely possible for Verra, for instance, to spin up and own and govern its own registry, side by side with Regen Registry on the same infrastructure. It would also be possible for them to fork Regen Ledger and run their own sovereign blockchain. And in either case, those are degrees of federation. In one case, we would share the same security, right? And we'd share the same code base, but we would be governing different crediting standards, right? And in the other case, you'd be sharing the same sort of, you'd be sharing some of the open source code, but you wouldn't be sharing the same security, and you'd be governing your own system. And which of those makes the most sense is really a political question, and it is an economic question. How much does it cost to run the state machine or the blockchain? How much security can it give? Is it better to have multiple different providers on the same system, or is it better to have different systems that interoperate? Honestly, we don't have the answers to all of these questions. We're going to see over time the economy, you know, this industry is going to evolve, and it's going to shake loose, and there's going to be processes in times like these of economic disruption and recession. It makes it much more likely that things consolidate, right? And that you have less systems that have a tighter degree of federation, right? That give up some degree of sovereignty in order to have more access to liquidity, or more access to security, or less technical debt that they have to service as a team, because that's a big part of things. It's just like having engineers running all of these things. You don't, the more complexity is, the harder it is. So, hopefully that's a useful riff, but I do definitely think federated systems are like already starting to emerge and a big part of where this all goes.
So what I think, like in the broader, like super zoom out context, the basics of what is happening now is that we have all this digital technology. The digital technology allows unprecedented transparency so that we get a look inside of many of the institutions that used to be opaque, like a black box, like what's going on the inside of Twitter, between what's the Twitter's interaction between the government. I don't know. But now with all these tools, it's like we know. It's like we know about, all these intrigues that used to be hidden. And this information just keeps coming out. And the net result is it constantly erodes trust in almost every former institution. And Web3 and these technologies and the federated approach is coming into this. And like, I think despite through the last year, it seems like the core thesis of Cosmos is quite strong. Like maybe there's fewer projects or whatever, but it's able to take a beating because, like some of these hyper centralized chains, once their token price dives, people have less incentive to ever return or ever build in those chains ever again. Because if I was a developer, I had some hit app and it just went to zero, then like I'm going to go find a new chain rather than try and rebuild on like whatever just died. So I think from the Web2 era, like open source as a trend was the effort to like consolidate all this work. Like everybody works together, shares resources, has a common open source language. So now we're seeing, I think, like Web3 decentralization is causing the open sourcing of institutions themselves in a way. Whereas, like, as you said, the registry, like before that was some like Web2, globalist, whatever, make up whatever right-wing conspiracy theory you want. But now it's like, well, those are all going to be hyper open. People aren't going to be trust anything that has even a little bit of lack of transparency. So now the whole ecosystem is going to like hyper transparent systems. And from the Web2 era, the big winner was kind of like the Linux Foundation. Like they figured out this model where they have like the head office, which just gets money in. It's like, hey, Microsoft, come sponsor us. Intel, come sponsor us. And then they just create this massive cluster of thousands and thousands of projects. And then they took the sponsorship money and then they used it to fund all these projects. So with Web3, this is like that Linux Foundation institution is changing into something else. And like that's like what Regen Network is doing with IBC and all these kinds of things. It seems like that's the direction things are heading. And it's so exotic. I don't even think there's words for it. Like Fediverse is the only thing I could think of, decentralized. So anyways,
Fediverse is good. And I think you're hitting the nail on the head that, I mean, we consider what we're doing at Regen Network to be building a new institution type. I mean, I think our, different people, it's like, there's that old, I think maybe Indian or like Hindu metaphor where there's all of these blind monks standing around an elephant and they're all, one holds the leg and they're like, it's a tree, and one grabs a hold of the trunk and it's like it's a snake, et cetera, et cetera. I guess when we wrap our arms around the challenges of natural capital markets, that is to say, bringing market mechanisms to repair, restore, and conserve Earth, which is our domain and our problem statement, what we care about. When we see market mechanisms being trialed and thought of and experimented with towards those ends, and we believe that if that's going to succeed, there actually needs to be a new and novel institution type. And that new and novel institution type wasn't possible before the advent of Web3, because it needs to be augmented by computational capability, by transparency, and by open governance. because it's a challenging coordination issue with multiple stakeholders who don't trust each other, yet need to manage complex things together, right? And blockchain and having a common ledger of record and assuming some amount of adversarial relationship between counterparties and creating like a digital version of the checks and balances that a constitutional government like the United States has, but reinvented in a digital era in a slightly different format, is like, that's what's happening. That's what, to me, that's what the entire crypto movement really is. That's what's really happening. And our little domain of it, where we're focused on ecological regeneration, that's what we're trying to innovate and build, is a new institution type, really, at the end of the day.
How do you keep this practical and grounded so that the people that aren't deep in this can actually like get it? And
we would just say, go buy some carbon credits.
and like as a corollary to that, it's like it's such a good marketing angle to say we're saving the planet. It's going to attract a lot of, you know, false prophets and signaling, like for the bias, like the average casual consumer, like how do they know? Like, how are they going to know what's good? Like, it must be frustrating to like, you know, this, maybe a lot of these projects are well-meaning, but maybe they don't have like the depth in certain areas that, you know, they lack the knowledge. Like, how do you navigate those frustrations would be my question.
Very frustrating. I don't have a clean answer for you, Rex. Honestly, it's just very frustrating. There's so much static and there's so little ability for people to discern between, you know, I was sort of cringing as you were talking about, you were sort of painting the picture of the collapse of our faith in institutions driven by an increase of information. But I mean, so I'll say two things. One is there's this great Terence McKenna quote, which is, as the surface area of the sphere of our knowledge increases, as the volume of our knowledge increases, so too does the surface area of our ignorance. So there's that. And then there's this other, and I don't remember whose law this is, but there's this other sort of like concept, which is actually the more information that's available, the less ability that most people have to make any sense of it. And so you get this like information overload and it becomes quite overwhelming. And so given that, I think it's just a patience game of, that's why we have Regen Ledger. We're trying to create a community governed ledger of record in which we can sense make together. That's why we've been doing experimentation with active inferencing and different AI models and things, you know, algorithms, you know, data. How do you check and communicate with someone and then double check that and say, yes, it checked out, in this kind of federated sense making? And ultimately, that's what Regen Network is. It's a federated sense-making system around ecological health and claims that are being made for that. In the short term, how do you, you know, avoid the hype or the static and just the confusion that the space has, refi, crypto, carbon markets in general, biodiversity? I was at the biodiversity, you know, conference in Montreal, and it's crazy. Like, people are like, it's like a gold rush, biodiversity. It's scary, really, because ultimately people are going to do bad things, and that kind of like confusion and complexity both breeds potential and it breeds, you know, potential for negative behavior. So I don't know. I mean, I don't have a super just sort of like down pat answer to that. It's the big problem that we face as a community and as a company, for sure.
So over the last couple weeks, like while I had off, I had to think really carefully about what I think comes next. And my background's all in silicon and IoT. And like one of the things we did struggle with in the silicon space is, like, I worked at ARM and we had a major open source competitor that had, you know, they're up and coming. But like one of the struggles we had at ARM is like how to tell our story without like pointing out the flaws in our competition. And like, I think ultimately we just didn't like there was one episode where they like did a comparative blog post and it went so badly with the community that we're like, never again. We just have Like we can't even touch that. We just say, here's what our stuff does. That's all you need to know. And like, unlike others, here's some things to think about, but we're not going to like, anyways. So bringing my silicon industry hat on, I just asked myself the question, like, what's going to happen next? And I came up with a scenario because one of the things that ARM did was invest a lot in sustainability and early forms of it. So it's like we produce all these microchips, like those use rare earth minerals that have to be dug out of the ground in the Congo by slave labor in many cases, or who knows. And I imagine this scenario where I go to an online store and I buy a Raspberry Pi. And that Raspberry Pi, when I buy it, like this is like 5 years from now, I'm not actually buying the Raspberry Pi, I'm buying a digital twin of the Raspberry Pi. And it's a dynamic NFT, which contains 50 different pieces of information. The provenance of every single component, the supply chain of where that component was and where it came from. It comes with a government mandated coupon, a recycling coupon that the EU says, if you buy a piece of electronics, $5 of it needs to go in this digital safe box that gets invested. And when it's time for me to recycle that Raspberry Pi, that coupon in that NFT is what's used to subsidize returning that back. So this NFT that contains all this information about the Raspberry Pi, that's what I buy. And when I get the Raspberry Pi, and eventually I try and return it, and I might even get paid for returning it. So with this push towards these central bank digital currencies, like a big reason for that is the government wants total visibility to everything that goes on in the economy. I started thinking about it. I was like, if the government's trying to do CBDCs, which is obviously probably unpopular in many corners of Web3, they're going to have to do this modeling of like an NFT or something like it, of like where it was and what's the carbon footprint and the environmental footprint of that. Because if I buy something, an object with the NFT, with the CBDC, I also want to know all about that object. And as you were talking about, the biodiversity credits and all these things, I'm like, man, like I think from the IoT space, we had this concept of a digital twin, but this digital twin is going to come forward somehow. And like, you're doing these registries, and that's kind of like you're making a digital twin of these natural resources is like what's at the base of it.
Maybe I'll try to tackle this one, at least to ground it into our context. So to me, in the world of Regen Network, the goal is twofold. One is the ledger is this transparent public database. You can't pretend what happened, didn't happen. You can always know. It's sort of level one with the autonomous security of having our own blockchain. And having our own blockchain makes us fundamentally different from really every other refi project out there, because we can build the custom software and the custom state machine that's necessary for evaluating ecological impact. And when you go up into the registry system, it ultimately sits on the back of having ecological standards by which you're looking at real world things, real trees, real rivers, real forests, real pieces of the ocean. And every standard has real science behind it that you have to follow. And then what arises onto the blockchain is that scientific data in structured and unstructured forms that moves with those assets permanently. So what we're building, beyond the blockchain governance and the like custom technology, is we're building a community of standards governance. And where Gregory was talking about, you're talking about Fediverse, our system of credit classes of ecological standards is designed itself as a Fediverse. You can have Regen Network standards, you can have Vera standards, but within the world of Regen Network standards, only one standard was ever produced by Regen Network Development Incorporated, Carbon plus Grassland. Every other standard that's coming down the pipeline is actually being developed by a third party using those processes and tools. So the Regen registry is itself a Fediverse within a system of Fediversing. So it's a little bit multidimensional, and it comes down to the belief that communities of scientific practice and land stewardship, that they know at an ecologically, like a scientific level, what is the most appropriate way to manage land, to monitor land, to quantify that, and what data needs to be presented in order to say, this carbon credit, this biodiversity credit, this biochar credit, whatever that land management or ocean management activity is, it's based on real information, real science. And to me, what we do is so very, very different than what ReFi does at large. ReFi does liquidity pools, it does forward contract pools, it does like attach digital credit to my app for something else pool. We do real native credit origination, partnering with land stewards that are planting trees and building farms and restoring rivers, because we're ecologists that have coupled up our spirits with our technologists and have built a system that allows for those assets to be created and governed. And to give you some real world examples here, because I have sort of like the what's coming up in front of me, you know, we have Colshan Carbon Trust in the state of Washington that's doing a biochar methodology developed from scratch, biochar pilots. They're going to be issuing 1,500 carbon credits from a standard that never existed before, you know, in March, it says here. We have a group in Argentina doing holistically managed cattle grazing, really actual cattle being grazed across actual land in Argentina that created a new standard that fits their use case. And they're issuing 70,000 carbon credits in the new year. There's dozens and dozens of these examples of agroforestry, of biochar, of riparian buffer restoration, where this is ecology. And what we're doing is we're creating standards and a community of scientists and practitioners that govern those standards, and a technical process that tracks that standard creation, that asset creation, and the data associated with that asset on the blockchain. So it's a very different, it's like, we're building a community by building the technical systems to support living systems, but our living system is really science and the governance of humans engaging with science and land together. So it's a very complex beast that is just, it gives me a lot of hope, because at scale, it really could be this fully transparent shared governance system of ecological standards. And moving money into standards requires the ability to say, this is real. It's happening in a real place and a real spot on the world with real people that took real action and quantified it. And we're sure that this thing happened. We're sure that regeneration is happening in this particular place.
So this reminds me of the progress of the silicon industry, where initially it started with Intel, and they're like, we fabricate the silicon and we design it. And then AMD came along and they found a new model, or others came along and they said, well, we used to have the foundry, but what if we get rid of that and let somebody else do the foundry, and we just design stuff and then somebody else does the foundry. Then ARM came along and they said, we just design stuff, no foundry whatsoever, like you license it and customize it, and then you act, and then finally the ultimate culmination is RISC-V, where they literally just open source the instruction set and it's all standards, and there's everything else is outsourced. So what you just said reminds me of that. And it kind of reminds me also of like open source, where like there's so much effort put into the licenses that are used in open source. Now, the fundamental innovation of ARM was designing this new business model where they get paid every time a chip built using their license gets sold. So they have this massive passive income stream. So I wonder for Regen Network, if there might be a new business model where you license your standards, and those you get paid out based on the number of assets issued, a tiny fraction. So one of the reasons that nobody's been able to compete with ARM is because the chips are so cheap and ARM undercharges. ARM charges less than they need to. So if you buy a $5 chip, then like a 10 cents or a penny or something goes to ARM. It's something really small. But if you sell 100 million of them, then it adds up. So with Regen, if like you're able to take the equivalent of your open source standards and then license them using blockchain and that kind of thing, I mean, that could be a quite interesting business model. And it would follow this, like it would put Regen on the tail end of the tangibility curve. It's like this, I don't know, it's imaginary thing of like from tangible to intangible. So it sounds like Regen is trying to be on the farthest end of intangibility as possible. And that has the highest leverage downstream, because everybody trickles down from those chip designs or policies that you come up with. So just an idea. I got to jump off, but thanks a lot, and think about that. ReFi Summit is coming back.
Can't wait for
Refi
Refi
Summit is
Summit.
really fun. Yeah, we're pro Refi Summit. It was really fun.
So I'm gonna
Everyone
send
should
you,
go.
so I'm gonna share this recording on the Refi Summit Substack. And thanks a lot. I gotta jump. Really fun every time.
Awesome. Ciao.
See you.